My parents offered to pay for my wedding but sent me the bill after giving my sister $400,000. But they were left in shock when I gave them the check and this letter. I never had the best relationship with my parents, but it wasn't terrible either. They always showed favoritism toward my sister, Sarah, but I learned to live with it. Sarah, now 32, I think is what you'd call the golden child. And I, at 28, was used to living in her shadow. I grew up watching her get the newest phones, better clothes, and more attention while I settled for hand-me-downs and started working at 16 to pay for the things I wanted. I didn't complain much. I understood that my parents weren't obligated to give me anything beyond the basics. Plus, I took pride in being independent. The real shock came when Sarah got married 3 years ago, and my parents gave her and her husband the incredible sum of $400,000 as a wedding gift, which they used to buy a beautiful house in a luxurious neighborhood. At the time, I was genuinely happy for her, though it hurt a little. I had my own life, was doing well as a software engineer, had saved a significant amount of money, and was dating Tom, who would later become my husband. I thought my moment would come, and didn't dwell on the fact that my parents had never given me anything remotely close to what they gave Sarah. After all, I didn't expect it. A year later, Tom proposed to me. We'd been together for years and he was everything I'd ever dreamed of in a partner. We planned a modest wedding, nothing too extravagant, because we wanted to save for the future. Neither of us wanted to spend all our savings on a single day, no matter how special. We budgeted around $36,000, which we felt was reasonable for the kind of wedding we wanted. Elegant, but not excessive. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the entire wedding. I felt touched, as though for once they were recognizing me as equally important. They seemed enthusiastic, asking about venues and vendors, and genuinely seemed interested in helping. I didn't think much about the amount. I assumed that since they'd already done so much for Sarah, maybe they wanted to do something for me as well. I never expected them to contribute anything close to what they gave Sarah. But their offer to cover the wedding seemed generous. The wedding day was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, exactly as we wanted. My parents gave speeches, danced with us, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like they were finally treating me equally, as though they were proud of me. Tom and I planned to go on our honeymoon the following week, but we had some work commitments to handle first. 2 days after the wedding, I received an email from my father. It wasn't a heartfelt note or a leftover gift card as I had imagined. Instead, it was a detailed invoice attached in PDF format listing every expense they had paid for the wedding. The email was brief and cold. Please settle this at your earliest convenience. Your mother and I expect prompt payment. I stared at the screen, unable to believe it. The invoice totaled $34,546.89, itemizing every floral arrangement and appetizer down to the last cent. Tom found me sitting there, frozen, and when I showed him the email, he was furious. It wasn't about the money. We could pay it if necessary, but that wasn't the point. My parents had offered to pay for the wedding. I hadn't asked them to cover a single expense. They came to me, offered it as a gift, and even seemed excited to be part of the planning process. At the wedding, they had even been bragging about being good parents who paid for their daughter's wedding. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about the money. It was the result of years of being treated as less than Sarah. When she got married, they gave her $400,000 as a gift, no strings attached. They didn't ask her to pay back a single cent, yet here they were billing me for my wedding, treating it as a loan, which it wasn't because they had never mentioned that. The next morning, after a sleepless night discussing everything with Tom, I made a decision. I sent my parents a check for the full amount, but I also included a letter. I didn't want to confront them directly because I knew I wouldn't be able to contain my emotions, and I didn't want it to turn into a shouting match. In the letter, I explained how hurt I felt. I reminded them that I'd been independent since I was paying for my own things while watching them give everything to Sarah. I wrote that when they offered to pay for the wedding, I naively thought they were finally treating me with the same love and care they always gave to my sister. Instead, they had betrayed me. I didn't hold back. I told them that throughout all this time, I'd let so many things go and never said a word about how differently they treated Sarah and me. But what I couldn't accept was this cruel deception. They had made me believe they were giving me a gift only to turn around and demand payment as if I were a stranger, not their daughter. I also wrote that this would be the last financial interaction we would ever have. From that moment on, I would reject any offers of help, support, or gifts from them. And I made it clear that I didn't want anything from them in the future, not even an inheritance. I told them they could give everything to Sarah, as they had already done with everything else. I mailed the check and letter and blocked their numbers. Tom supported my decision, and I felt a sense of relief after sending everything. They remained completely silent for days. Then, messages started pouring in from distant relatives. Aunts, uncles, and family friends began calling and messaging, accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. They said my parents had done so much for me and that I was overreacting. Sarah also called me, yelling that I was tearing the family apart. She said I should have just paid the bill without making a fuss. Typical Sarah, always taking their side. How could she not? I haven't responded to any of them because I don't know what to say. On one hand, I feel my actions are justified. After years of being treated as the second option, this felt like the last straw, and I wanted to stand up for myself. But on the other hand, I keep wondering if I'm overreacting. Am I being too sensitive? Was it irrational of me to expect them to treat my wedding as a gift, just like they did with Sarah's? Should I have just accepted it, paid the bill, and moved on? Tom's family has been incredibly supportive throughout all of this. His parents were horrified when they found out what my parents did and have been checking in on us every day. But the constant messages from my side of the family are starting to wear me down. Now, I'm really stuck and not sure if I'm the one in the wrong. Part of me feels I had every right to be upset and stand up for myself. But another part wonders if I've created an irreparable rift in my family. Maybe I should have handled things differently. Update 1. Since my last post, things have gotten worse. I had no idea that the simple act of sending that check and letter would trigger such a reaction. But here we are. Yesterday morning, I woke up to an email from my mother. It went through because she used her work email, which I hadn't blocked yet. The email was long and condescending. In it, she explained that the bill they sent me wasn't meant to be taken seriously. According to her, they never intended to cash the check. It was all in her words, a life lesson about financial responsibility. They wanted to test my reaction. And once they felt I had learned the lesson, they planned to tear up the check and surprise me with a real wedding gift of $100,000. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A life lesson? What kind of parents deceive their adult daughter like this? After reading that, it became even clearer to me that this wasn't about love or fairness. It was about control. They wanted to see if I would push back or blindly comply. It felt manipulative and cruel. In response to my mother's email, I sent her a brief reply. I kept it simple and to the point. Thank you for confirming that this was, in fact, a deliberate test and not a misunderstanding. After sending it, I blocked her work email too. I knew they'd try to contact me more, but I wasn't interested in any more games or lessons. Later that evening, things escalated even further. Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced. She started banging on the door, shouting my name. At first, I didn't respond, hoping she'd give up and leave, but she didn't. Instead, she started yelling through the door, saying I was being childish and making this issue bigger than it needed to be. She said our parents were just trying to teach me responsibility because they were worried about my spending habits. That comment, coming from Sarah of all people, made my blood boil. This was the same woman who had never paid her own phone bill, never worked a single day without my parents' support, and yet she had the audacity to lecture me on financial responsibility. As she kept talking, I quietly started recording everything on my phone. I wasn't sure what might happen next, but I wanted to have evidence in case this got even more complicated. Sarah kept ranting about how I was tearing the family apart over something so trivial and that I should just apologize to our parents and move on. She said they never intended to hurt me and had always done their best for both of us. She insisted I was overreacting and that this entire situation was my fault. I didn't respond. I didn't open the door. I just sat there listening, silently furious. Finally, after what felt like forever, she left, but not before calling me selfish and accusing me of trying to sever ties with the family over money. That night, I received even more messages from distant relatives. Apparently, Sarah had gone straight to my parents after her failed attempt to talk to me, and now they were rallying everyone. My phone was flooded with messages from aunts, uncles, and even some family friend. Most of the messages followed the same pattern, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of causing unnecessary drama, and urging me to apologize to my parents for how I had treated them. One message in particular stood out. It was from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. She said I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me these lessons, and that I should be grateful they were willing to spend so much on my wedding. She ended her message by saying, I was fortunate to have parents who wanted to be involved in my life. I couldn't believe how quickly everyone had turned against me. It was as if they had all decided my parents were right just because they were the ones with the money and power. No one cared about the emotional manipulation or the years of favoritism that had led to this situation. They only saw that I was rejecting my parents' supposed generosity, and that was enough for them to take their side. At this point, Tom was starting to worry about how much this was affecting me. He kept asking if I wanted to take a break from social media and turn off my phone for a while to give myself some peace. He tried to reassure me, reminding me that I wasn't wrong and pointing out all the times my parents had shown favoritism towards Sarah and, as always, used money as a tool to manipulate both of us. The most frustrating part was that I couldn't get real answers. My parents weren't trying to reach out to explain further. They genuinely believed their own narrative, seeing themselves as the misunderstood parents who were just trying to help, while I was the ungrateful daughter who had blown everything out of proportion. For now, I'm trying to focus on the life Tom and I are building together. There's not much more we can do now. Just wait and hope things get better, I suppose. Update 2. I wanted to start by thanking everyone for their responses. While I've tried to stay strong, things continue to unfold. A few days after Sarah's visit, I got a call from my dad's brother, my uncle. I hadn't spoken to him in years and honestly didn't know what to expect. He's never been very close to the family, so I thought he was calling to tell me to fix things with my parents like everyone else. Instead, what my uncle told me left me speechless and put everything into perspective in a way I hadn't seen before. He started by saying he had heard about what was happening through the family and felt the need to reach out because, apparently, this wasn't the first time my parents had done something like this. 20 years ago, something similar happened between him and my grandparents, my father's parents. My uncle had refused to go along with my grandparents' manipulative tactics, and as a result, they smeared his name throughout the family, accusing him of trying to steal from them and being ungrateful for everything they had done for him. He explained that back then, my father didn't support him. In fact, he took their parents' side, which led to a major rift between the two brothers that never fully healed. My uncle said he always felt abandoned by my father, and it took him years to come to terms with how our family truly worked. Hearing him talk about the past was like hearing my own story, but in a different context. My grandparents had used money and manipulation to control my uncle, just like my parents are trying to do with me now. The more he talked, the more sense it all made. My parents weren't acting out of character. They were repeating a pattern set long before I was born. They had learned this behavior from their own parents, and my father, having been complicit in his brother's situation so many years ago, was now playing the same role with me. My uncle also mentioned that his refusal to comply with my grandparents' demands had serious consequences. After the fallout, my grandparents completely cut him off. Financially and emotionally, they painted him as the black sheep of the family. And even to this day, there are relatives who still believe the lies my grandparents told about him. It's all about control, he said, and when they couldn't control me, they erased me from their lives just like that. Hearing my uncle's story gave me chills. It was like a reflection of what I'm going through now. My parents were upset because I refused to play their game, and instead of trying to understand my perspective, they had turned the entire family against me. I began to see how deeply rooted this toxic cycle was and how ingrained my parents were in the belief that they could control their children through manipulation. After my conversation with my uncle, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he had told me. It made me wonder if, deep down, my father's behavior was driven by guilt. Maybe he knew he had abandoned his brother all those years ago and was now trying to justify his actions by using the same tactics. My parents had built their relationship with Sarah and me around the idea that we owed them something, and any deviation from that script was seen as a betrayal. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about me. It was about them, their own unresolved issues, and the unhealthy dynamics they had learned from their parents. In the days that followed, I continued receiving more messages from relatives. It became obvious that Sarah had been working overtime to turn people against me. One of my cousins with whom I'd always had a good relationship sent me a long message saying I was being selfish and disrespectful for not appreciating everything my parents had done for me. She told me it wasn't too late to fix things, but I needed to humble myself and apologize before it was too late. Her message was filled with the same rhetoric everyone else had been using, and it was exhausting to read. I realized I had grown up in a family where love was conditional. Everything came with strings attached: financial help, emotional support, or even something as simple as celebrating a life event like a wedding. And now that I had refused to follow their rules, they were isolating me, just as they had done to my uncle. Tom has been such a rock throughout all of this. After the call with my uncle, we sat down and had a long conversation about the future. He told me that no matter what happens, we'll face it together, and that I don't owe anyone, my parents, Sarah, or especially the relatives who had suddenly become armchair psychologists. His support has been unwavering, and I'm grateful beyond words. Then something strange happened. I received a voicemail from my dad using another number, likely from a relative. It was the first time he had tried to contact me directly since I sent the letter and check. His voice sounded different, not angry or demanding, as I had expected. Instead, he sounded tired. In the message, he said he didn't want to fight anymore and was willing to talk if I was open to it. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what had happened, but it was clear that something had changed. Maybe he was starting to realize that I wasn't going to back down this time. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to call him back and see if there's a chance to have an honest conversation about everything, but another part of me knows this could just be another attempt to guilt me into giving in. My uncle's words keep echoing in my head. They will never admit they're wrong because they don't believe they are. If I decide to talk to my dad, I need to be prepared for the possibility that nothing will change. I want to believe that my parents can change, that they can finally see me as an equal and not just someone they can control. But I also know that after years of being treated this way, it's going to take more than one conversation to repair the damage. As much as I want a clear answer, I'm still in the same boat as always, and maybe that's okay. I'll keep you updated as things progress, but for now, I'm just trying to navigate this the best I can. Update 3. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate all your responses. Your advice and support have been invaluable as I try to handle this mess with my family. When I first posted, I didn't know where everything was heading or what I wanted to do. But after reading your comments and reflecting a lot, I've come to some important realizations. Something that really struck me about your responses was that many of you pointed out how I had spent so long forcing myself to try to fix things with my mom and dad, trying to patch up the relationship and pretend everything was fine. But the truth is, I finally accepted that it's okay if things don't go back to normal because, honestly, I'm not even sure what normal was. The dynamic with my parents has always been unhealthy, and I've spent years trying to ignore it. Now I realize it's okay to let go of the idea that things will ever be how I wish they could be. Many of you also pointed out that perhaps I had been too lenient in assuming that my dad's behavior was driven by guilt. Looking back, I see that I was clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, his actions were motivated by guilt and that he could change. You were right. Guilt doesn't justify his actions, nor does it excuse the years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional control. No matter how guilty he may feel, it doesn't erase the harm that's been done. Nor does it mean I should forgive him just like that. At the same time, I've realized that I need closure. I need to close this chapter of my life, whether or not it involves reconciliation with my parents. So I decided to meet with my dad. I felt it was something I needed to do for myself, not for them. When I met with my dad, I immediately noticed he wasn't the same person I grew up fearing. He looked exhausted, almost defeated, and for the first time in my life, he seemed genuinely remorseful. He didn't say "I'm sorry" in those exact words, but he did apologize for how things had turned out with the wedding and for how both my mom and Sarah had treated me. He even mentioned that he had spoken to some of our relatives and asked them to stop harassing me, which was a small relief. But then he did something that completely caught me off guard. He tried to give the money back. He pulled out the same check I had sent him to cover the wedding expenses and slid it toward me, asking me to take it back. He said that he and my mom had discussed it and wanted to make things right. This time, I was prepared. I told him as clearly as I could that I wasn't going to accept the money back. I made it clear that this wasn't just about money. It was about everything that had happened over the years, about how they had always treated me as a second option, and about the emotional toll it had taken on me. I explained that taking the money back wouldn't fix any of that, and that this was no longer a financial transaction, just like the supposed check that only came up after everything unraveled. I could see his frustration when I refused to take the money. It was as if he didn't know what else to offer me. In his mind, returning the money was his way of saying sorry, but it didn't address the deeper issues that had poisoned our relationship for years. He couldn't see that the damage wasn't something a check could undo. After I told him I wouldn't take the money, he was silent for a few minutes before saying he didn't want to lose me. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand and that he didn't want our family to fall apart. I could see he was trying to be sincere, but even in that moment, I realized I wasn't looking for reconciliation in the way he was. I wasn't interested in going back to how things were or pretending everything could suddenly be okay. What I needed was space, a true break from the dynamics that had defined our relationship for so long. So I told him I needed a break from the family and that, while this meeting had been important, it didn't change much. I explained that I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget, and that I needed time to heal in my own way. He didn't argue with me, which surprised me. He just nodded and said he understood. He didn't try to convince me to come back or tell me I was overreacting as he had in the past. In a way, that was more of an apology than anything else he could have said. Maybe this doesn't solve our problems, but at least it feels like some kind of closure for me. If nothing else happens with my story, then this will be my final update. Update 4. Many people have asked why I haven't responded to the relatives who sided with my parents. While I may not have mentioned it before, I actually have, but those interactions weren't worth detailing. To every family member who tried to convince me that I was being dramatic or ungrateful because my parents had done so much for me, I responded with one simple question. Like what? Interestingly, most of them went silent or tried to change the subject, going back to their usual arguments about how I was the villain for questioning my parents. So, honestly, there wasn't much to share about those interactions. They were more of the same, but as I said, I would update if something genuinely new happened. Here I am. My parents have cashed the check, and while this might seem like something that should upset me, it really doesn't. In fact, I prefer for any financial ties with them to be completely settled. If they feel I truly owed them the wedding money, then they should take it. With that, I hope to close that chapter for good. However, it doesn't end there because with my family, things never truly end, especially when it comes to favoritism. I recently found out that my sister has been having trouble getting pregnant and has apparently started fertility treatments. On its own, this wouldn't be unusual. But given the history and the timing, it all seems like part of a pattern. I have no concrete proof that my parents decided to pay for Sarah's treatment, but the fact that they cashed my check right now seems, at the very least, suspicious. After doing some research, I saw that these treatments can cost anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 or more depending on the process and location. And considering that Sarah has always been financially dependent on my parents, it would make complete sense for them to cover the costs. Don't get me wrong, when I gave the check to my parents, it was with the intention of settling debts. I don't mind them using that money however they want. But considering that just weeks ago, my dad seemed remorseful and expressed a desire to return the money, this feels like yet another game on their part. What hurts most isn't the money itself, but the fact that the same dynamic is repeating again. This situation is a constant reminder of all the times I was sidelined in favor of Sarah. So after talking it over with Tom and processing everything, I've decided to do something I never thought I'd do: share my story openly. My uncle, who has already shared with me his own story of manipulation and control within the family, fully supports me. We've decided to publish a letter on my social media accounts detailing everything that has happened from my perspective and his. My part of the letter will cover my entire story, the way I was treated as a child, the emotional and financial manipulation, and everything that has led me to take this stance. My uncle will include his own experience, sharing how he too was subjected to this type of treatment and how he suffered the consequences of not giving in to the family's pressure. I didn't make this decision lightly. I know that by going public with this story, I'll probably face a flood of reactions, and not all of them will be favorable. But I'm tired, so if the rest of the family still wants to side with my parents, that's fine by them. I won't have any more contact with them either way. Once they've read what we have to say, I'll block them and move on with my life. There's likely to be one more update after this when I share the reactions and the consequences that this decision has brought. Update 5. Here is what I hope will be my last update on all of this. 2 weeks ago, we published the letter containing my story and my uncle's. The responses have been swift, bringing with them some revelations and, in a way, a sense of relief. To begin with, I confirmed that my parents did, in fact, pay for my sister's fertility treatment. It's not a surprise, of course, but getting public confirmation thanks to comments made in response to the post gave me the certainty I needed to fully see the reality without any doubts. It's sad to realize how deep the favoritism runs and how obvious it is to everyone, but it reaffirms that I'm not crazy and that I haven't imagined any of the things I've experienced. The reaction from family members was, unfortunately, predictable. Most sided with my parents, justifying their actions in countless ways and repeating the same old excuses. Even when faced with evidence of manipulation and favoritism, the toxicity seems to run deep in this family's veins. To them, my parents couldn't possibly be that bad, and there's always some explanation that absolves them. Some even had the audacity to claim that they did it for my own good, to teach me to be stronger. However, I also received a few different kinds of messages. Some apologies came through, as well as a few more neutral comments from relatives who didn't take sides, perhaps understanding a bit more about where my pain comes from. Though these messages were lukewarm at best. Still, there were very few exceptions, and the vast majority remained loyal to my parents and my sister. My parents also responded, although in very different ways. My father tried to address some points of the story, partially admitting to some mistakes, but still using excuses that downplayed the real damage. Meanwhile, my mother and sister stuck to the same old narrative,